But the whole country could talk for hours because one of the most fascinating men I knew. But the personal magnetism of this man not only persuaded the younger generation of economists, and if I had been a much younger man and a student, I probably would have swept off my feet as much as most of the other people.
Like Nixon.
No.
What did Nixon mean when he said he was a Keynesian, as far as in your understanding, Mr. Roach?
Well, I hope that he meant only that these policies had become so widespread in our time that they had to be dealt with as a part of our considerations. I hope he did not mean that he literally thought that spending more money somehow created more wealth. The thing I would like to address myself to for just a moment is that the reason that the Keynesian policies were so successful and so all-pervasive in Great Britain was essentially because of the ultimate political pressure that the organized labor forces brought to bear. The same thing's been true to a lesser extent here in the United States. Things like minimum wage and the rest that have obvious effects of keeping people out of the labor market are all essentially labor-oriented, and I think that may be changing. The practical politics that once caused the average working man to be aggressively oriented toward organized labor might not be working any longer. For example, if you go into a bar in Hamtramck in our time and hear what the UAW worker at General Motors is saying these days, he's very concerned about inflationary wage increases, which appear to give him more money, but which only keep him about even in purchasing power. Meanwhile, he's being pushed up into higher and higher tax brackets as a result of this, and on net balance he has considerably less purchasing power than had been the case previously. In other words, the ability of organized labor to hold its troops together on these issues and put on the kind of pressure necessary to push for this may be coming to an end.
You're perfectly right, but I would like to add one thing. You see, another political element was that, of course, the politicians just lapped up the argument when Keynes taught them, if you outspend your income and run a deficit, you're doing good to the people in general. The politicians didn't want to hear anything more than that, to be told that irresponsible spending was a beneficial thing, and that's how the thing became so influential.
Well, let me ask you this. Are you prepared to say that Keynes did not come out with a general theory of income and employment, or are you prepared to say that nothing that he said is generally applicable? Concretely, is it or is it not correct that in a free society you will not have downward mobile wage rates to help to adjust business cycles?
Well, depends very largely on policy and what is being tolerated. I think Keynes claimed to have provided a general theory is just wrong. There's no question to me about this. In spite of his extreme intelligence, he just made one or two fundamental mistakes. Largely, it was a fact I mentioned before. You know, he wasn't mainly an economist. Was a great figure who was concerned about public affairs, who had spent half of his university studies on economics and thought he was competent to advise on this thing, and constructed overnight. In fact, he didn't construct one theory. The most characteristic thing of the man, he constructed theory after theory to justify the same policy which he instinctively believed was the appropriate one, but which happened to be wrong.
It was one of these that you challenged, as I remember, in the early 30s.
Well, I did challenge his first theory. I spent a lot of time to criticize his treatise on money, which came out before the general theory, in 2 long journal articles. But when I published the second one, Keynes told me, oh, never mind, I no longer believe that. So when he came out with his general theory, I thought he was not going to waste my time against criticizing. But that book was the one which became so frightfully important. I've regretted for the rest of my life that I did not return to the charge then.
Well, why, Mr. Roach, how do you account for the cordite at Harvard University that was touched by this book, when the labor union pressures were by no means as acute as they were in Great Britain, why did the whole of the Harvard Economics Department, with one or two valiant exceptions, go up in flames with enthusiasm over this? What is the explanation? Is it psychological or intellectual?
One of the really interesting situations of our time rests in the reaction of the liberal intellectual community to various problems, and this is a perfectly good case in point. It's something that I hope somewhere in the course of our time together, Professor Hayek has a chance to discuss this, because there is an enormous change between 19th century liberalism, classical liberalism, and 20th century collectivist liberalism. And in that change, I think we see just the mythology that you're describing. There are some things that are so deeply believed that we reach the point where you say, don't confuse me with the facts, my mind is made up. So whatever the political pressures or absence in that spectrum, there is a kind of intellectual in our time who is determined to see only one side of the issue until he is absolutely shaken from it. We may be seeing that now, incidentally. The same changes that are occurring in organized labor seem to be occurring in the intellectual community as well, but wisdom takes time.
Well, Mr. Hayek, you wrote a very famous essay on the intellectuals and socialism, in which you attempted, I think quite successfully, to show why socialism is so nubile for the intellectuals. What is that thesis of yours, and do you still defend it?
Oh, certainly, yes. Well, it's a very interesting story intellectually. One of the dominant ideas which governs thinking since the 18th century is the idea that we can make everything to our pleasure, that we can design social institutions in their working. Now, that is basically mistaken. Social institutions have never been designed and do much more than we know. They have grown up by a process of selection of the successful without people frequently know why it was successful. That applies to the market. The market is I was going to say most ingenious, but ingenious without having been designed, instrument which enables us to utilize knowledge which is distributed among hundreds of thousands of people. It's an adaptation to thousands of circumstances which nobody ever can know as a whole, and where the prices formed on the market tell the individual what to do and what not to do in the social interest. Now, in order to understand this, you have to know economics. To the naive person who imagines all the distribution of income is determined by somebody deliberately and actively, it seems that if this is the responsibility of a particular guide, this is evidently done very unjustly. The fact is, it's not being done unjustly because we achieve all that we do achieve by having come to agree to play a sort of game in which the game of the market, as I likely to call it, in which, because we are utilizing more information, more facts than anybody knows, the outcome for a particular individual is necessarily unpredictable. Now, an outcome which is unpredictable and undesigned by anybody cannot be just as little as the outcome of a game of chance can be a just game. But people resent this, and the people who imagine, oh, it should be possible to design all this, to arrange this, accept the government to do this in a manner so that the distribution is just. Now, that is literally impossible, because it would require that all this widely dispersed information about particular facts and particular circumstances and particular gifts can be used and controlled by a central authority.
Why couldn't the role of the justice maker come at the end of a process by taking from someone who has more than he needs for the purpose of satisfying somebody who has less than he needs?
Because if he knows that part of his income is going to be taken from him, there's no inducement for him to do that particular thing. If I know that if I do a thing which will fetch a very high price, 2/3 of it are being taken from me, and I can do something much more pleasant for 1/3 of the income without paying any income tax, I'm going to do that and not going to do what's most beneficial to society.
Well, but in point of fact, a great many people who are taxed at the 2/3 rate continue to be very productive.
Well, I doubt whether they are as productive as they could be.
All right, but let's say they are less productive than they could be. But how do you answer the question that the demands of justice are perhaps approached after you have permitted a natural distribution of the proceeds through the market
There are
mechanism?
no possible rules of a just distribution in a system where the distribution is not deliberately the result of people bringing it about. I mean, justice is an attribute of individual action. I can be just or unjust towards my fellow man. But the conception of a social justice, to expect from an impersonal process which nobody can control to bring about a just result, is not only a meaningless conception, it's completely impossible. See, everybody talks about social justice, but if you press people to explain to you what they mean by social justice, what they would accept as just, nobody knows. I'm telling you because I've been trying for the past 20 years, asking people, what really are your principles of social justice?
Well, the fact that people may disagree as to the definition of social justice does not in and of itself argue against the right of a society to attempt to extract a consensus.
Well, they have been trying to do this, but they haven't got anything like a consensus.
Well, in all democratic societies, there is an operative consensus because of the codification of the redistribution laws.
There is a consensus of entrusting a particular authority with redistribution.
Yeah.
But then you ask how it's being done. It's being done not by agreeing on any principles, but buying the support of particular little groups. The people who get more are not determined by an agreement of the majority. The people who, by withholding their particular vote, might endanger the governing party. There's nothing like an agreement of a just distribution. The distribution which government effects is the price it pays, or rather the concessions it makes to the extortions of particular little group who say we will not support you if you don't give us an extra benefit.
Well, what if you were to remark a correspondence between the flow of philanthropy and the flow of redistributionist money? Would that just be a coincidence?
It
For
would be a
instance,
coincidence. There's nothing like it.
Suppose 50% of Mr. Roach's college fund were supplied by individuals and 50% of it was supplied by government. Would you say that there was a natural correspondence between the ideas of justice as screened through the distillery of free minds and as screened through the representative government?
See, our possibility of being charitable is limited by the extent of our knowledge of particular people and particular needs. The benefactors of your college will do so for an institution they know, for a group of people they know, where they have. But see, the great problem is that we have developed what's called a greater open society, which deals with an infinitely much larger number of people than anybody can know. Nobody can form an idea what a steel worker in Indiana compared with a cotton worker in South America, in the southern states, deserves in any sense. We have no instinctive feeling about this. When we believe that we have a sense of social justice, that's an inherited trait which we have developed from the life in the small group in which mankind lived for 1 million years before it developed the open society. Of course, in a little hunting band of 50 people or so, it was essential that you assigned an appropriate share to each member. But this native instinct, which we had to overcome in order to form a large society, is suddenly coming up again when the great majority of people operate in large organizations, do no longer understand the market, and so we are reverting to very primitive instincts. instincts which we have overcome when we emerged from the little